First off, thanks again to everybody who joined today. This is part 2 of our Diving into Data webinars. So we had one webinar on Tuesday led by Miriam Strauss, and that recording is now on the website. And tonight is actually the 4th webinar in a series of 7, all about supporting teachers and students in Data Jam. And so next week, we actually have 2 webinars that are focused on the creative component of Data Jam. And we have a special guest from Wasaic Project, which is an artist residency in Armenia. Shelley, is that right? In Armenia. And the co-director there, Bowie Zanino, will be leading that webinar. And then Thursday, we have David Wong from The Art Effect is going to be leading us in a webinar about infographics, which I'm really excited about. And I should also introduce myself. My name is Ashley Allred, and I'm the education program leader at CARI. And you all are probably familiar with CARI. We're in Millbrook, New York, and we are an independent nonprofit center for environmental research. And we have scientists that are studying all sorts of things from forests to fresh water to cities and disease ecology. And our education team really focuses on getting kids outside, especially in a normal year on campus at CARI, as well as in their schoolyards. For those of you who are new to Data Jam, the Hudson Data Jam is a competition where middle school and high school students and families can choose an ecological data set from the local Hudson Valley region. And the data are collected from scientists at CARI, as well as other organizations in the area, like the Department of Conservation, Environmental Conservation. And students look through these data sets, they find patterns, they find the story in the data, and then they are tasked with making a creative project to communicate to people who might not know about what's going on in their own backyard here in the Hudson Valley. Some general housekeeping. You are, of course, welcome to have your camera on or off. And as a reminder, this is being recorded tonight and will be posted on our website tomorrow. And without further ado, I'd love to introduce you all to Shelley Forster, who was the education program leader at CARI and has a ton of awesome experience with Data Jam. So take it away, Shelley.
Thank you. I'm excited to be with you today. And I just want to let you all know that this is going to be an interactive webinar today. I'm going to have you graphing along with me and answering some questions. So if you are willing to go off mute for the webinar, you don't have a lot of background noise or feedback from your microphone, and you want to just unmute throughout the webinar and ask questions and participate in that way, that's great. Okay, so let's get started. Okay, so first, I want to show you me and who I am, and then I want to hear about who you all are. So as Ashley mentioned, I worked at CARI for about 5 years, and I ran summer camp and Hudson Data Jam. I did field trips to CARI and also to schoolyards. I did some teacher workshops and had a whole lot of fun. And these days, I'm working with the Kingston YMCA Farm Project in Kingston, New York, and I'm building and installing garden beds in the community with the teenagers. And I'm really excited that next week, we're going to go out and start working on the eel project with the teens and collect eels in the Black Creek tributary. Is anybody else on here participating in the eel project this year? Okay, maybe someday. All right, so I want to hear who you all are. So why don't we try, it's a small webinar, so maybe we can actually try introducing ourselves over the mic. I want to hear your name and your location, the grade or age of learners that you work with, and a nerdy question, your favorite type of graph. So let's start with Cindy.
Hi, I'm Cindy. I work at Arlington High School. In the high school, I teach 10th through 12th, so mostly chemistry. I do Regents chemistry, AP chemistry, and I have a section of independent research. And that is such a great question. I guess I would have to say line graph because that's what I use the most. Yeah, so line graph.
Right, sweet. I gotta say my favorite, it's not really useful, but I just love the pie chart. It's almost never something I see, but it's a fun graph. Vincent, are you plugged in? Okay, maybe not. Sue, do we have you on mic?
Hi, I am Sue Chanfrani, and I work at Oakwood Friends School in Poughkeepsie. Ashley, I recognize you from EcoQuest this summer. One of my kids attended. And I'm going to be helping with the middle school this year. The Data Jam has a big reputation here at Oakwood. Miriam used to be here and run it for us. So we're trying to fill big shoes, but we are gaining some interest for this year. Again, with middle schoolers. And my favorite type of graph is also the pie chart. I love it. Just it all fits together into a whole, and it tells a lot of information that way.
Awesome, thank you. Kimberly, how about you?
Hi, I teach at the Spire Legacy School in New York City. I teach middle schoolers, 7th and 8th grade. And I did Data Jam with some of my students about 3 years ago, I think. And things have never been aligned to do it again, but this is the year. So we're back and I'm very excited. And I guess it's hard to say, but you know, I'm probably a line graph kind of person too. I love the way it tells a story, you know, you just follow that line and you have this like story unfold. So I think that's probably my favorite, though it's hard to pick. I love them all.
That's great. Welcome back to Data Jam.
Thanks.
And let's try Vincent one more time if he's with us. Nope. Okay. Well, here we go. So I want to give you a quick overview of what we're going to do today. We are going to brainstorm the types of data we would need to explore an essential question, which will be revealed soon. We're going to identify some data sets within the actual Data Jam page that you can use for answering our question. And we're going to make a graph in Google Sheets. And then using TUVA, which is an interactive software that's super easy to use with students because everything in there is drag and drop. And I'm hoping that one of our bonus activities today is we're going to make some new friends, learn about some birds as we explore an essential question. Okay, so y'all ready for the essential question? Your clue is we're going to be studying the Hudson watershed, which I think most of you are located in. And what we're going to explore today is whether climate change is happening in the Hudson Valley. And I'm sure you all have some strong thoughts and feelings about that. But we're going to look at how data can help us explore this question. And one of the things I like to include in presentations about climate change is this map. This is from the Yale program on climate change communication. They did surveys around the country in 2019 on questions related to what they call global warming, which is a charged term compared to climate change. But one of the things they asked adults was whether they think global warming is happening. And they found that only 67% of adults in the US actually think that it's happening. And this map shows you anywhere that's orange, people were more likely to say, yes, global warming or climate change is happening. And the darker the orange, the higher the percentage of people who said yes. And then anywhere it's blue, were lower percentages of people who don't think global warming and climate change are happening. So some of these blues you see right here are like 45% or so of adults think that global warming is happening. So what I want to do today is look at some data that can actually help us connect climate change to our local area and help people make sense of climate change and what's happening around them. Before I move on, does anyone want to react to this map? Anything you notice or anything you're surprised by? Okay, we can move on. So what I want to ask you all to do is help me think about what data you would want to help us answer this essential question about whether climate change is happening in the Hudson Valley. So I put together a Jamboard, which is totally new for me. I know some of you have probably used it in your classroom. So I'm going to experiment with this today and hope you all bear with me and help me learn how to use Jamboard. But I'm going to set this up. And Ashley's going to share a link to this Jamboard that you should all get in the chat. So if you click on that link, you're going to see this screen and you're going to see that your prompt is, what data would help us answer this question? Is climate change happening in the valley?
I'm seeing
Yep.
or Cindy says it says we need access to it.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, when I click on it, I can get into it, but I'm not sure.
So if you, yeah,
Cool. How about now?
let me try again. That looks good.
Yes. Okay, we have Anonymous Dingo. I'm guessing that's Cindy. Anonymous Skunk. Great. Here we go. Okay, so quick intro to Jamboard. All you have to do to answer my question is click on this sticky note over on the left, and it's going to let you type something in. So I'm going to say, if I wanted to know if climate change is happening in the Hudson Valley, I would want air temperature data. That's a pretty easy one. So I'm going to hit save, and then that sticky note is going to pop right up. All right, so I'll give you all a minute to come up with some ideas.
Sorry.
And you can feel free to put in a couple. And Ashley, you're also invited to participate in all of these activities.
Thank you.
I need to switch to my computer. I can't do it from my phone. I'll join you in a sec.
Sounds good.
Sorry.
No problem. Okay, so I'm seeing precipitation amounts has come in, sea level change, changes in plant or animal populations, and air temperature. Awesome. I want to hear more from whoever put in changes in plant or animal populations. What do you mean by that?
That was me. Well, for plants, I was thinking about flowers blooming, maybe earlier in the year. Animal populations, I was thinking of amphibians and other animals that may be more sensitive to changes in air and water temperature.
Nice. So we added in when do flowers bloom, changes in migratory animal habits. Perfect. I love that. So these are some of the things that we could begin looking at to actually answer this question about whether climate change is happening in the Hudson Valley. I'm guessing if we looked at all of these, we would see strong signs that climate change is happening, but these are the kind of data that we would actually want to use and explore to support our hypothesis that climate change is happening in the Hudson Valley. So thanks for brainstorming with me. I'm going to show you some of the data that's actually available in the Hudson Data Jam for exploring these kinds of topics. Hang on just a sec. Okay, so I imagine some of you have navigated to the Hudson Data Jam page before. I know Kimberly has done Data Jam. Cindy had some time looking at Data Jam datasets today, but I want to show you a little bit of this collection, and then we're going to dive in deep into a bird dataset. So on the Hudson Data Jam page, we have all of these images and descriptions of data sets. So I'm just going to slowly scroll around and let's see if we can find 3 data sets that we think would help us investigate climate change. So if you see one, shout it out or put it in the chat.
Hudson River
Well,
temperature.
right there.
Hudson River temperature for sure, right? We can look and see if the temperature is fluctuating more or increasing.
Temperature and precipitation.
Mhm.
Hurricane impacts.
Yeah, why do you think that one might help us look at climate change?
More energy in the atmosphere makes more energetic storms, I guess.
Yeah, totally agree. Let's see if we can find maybe one more.
Ooh. The fecal indicator and rainfall.
Ah, interesting. How might that help us look at climate change?
Well, I'm not really sure what fecal matter is being tested there, but the bacteria, which I'm sure thrive in different temperatures and environments, and also the rainfall data, I guess that's kind of like what I was saying with the hurricane, though.
Extreme rainfall events increase, so you could possibly have more, overflowing, more combined sewage overflow issues for extreme rain events.
Yeah, I totally agree. Good. I love that we're making these connections to climate change. So I want to pick one that we haven't gotten to yet, and we're going to spend the bulk of our webinar today actually looking at this data set together. So one of my favorite data jam sets here is the spring bird migration dates in Dutchess County. I'm going to open that up and give you a quick tour. And actually, it looks like we might be getting some feedback from Kimberly. So maybe you want to mute when you're not talking and then pop back in.
Sorry.
See if that helps. Cool. Okay, so we're in the spring bird data set. And this is a great data set because it shows you a 123-year record from 1885 to 2008 of when birds were first seen on their migratory path in Dutchess County. So it looks at different bird species and when they were seen in March or in April or maybe even in February, the first sighting. And it's a really cool data set because the scientist Bill Schlesinger, who assembled it, went through old records about from birding clubs to see when people had first seen those birds. So to show you how to navigate into this data set, the first thing that's really, really important is it has some resources that tell you more about the data. If you look right here, we have a link to historical bird migration background sheet. And I'm going to open that up because this tells you all about the data set. And it will show you the metadata of who collected the data, how they did, what the variables were, etc. And I just wanted to show you really quick the pictures of the birds that we're going to be looking at today, in case you've never seen them before. So this data set is about the American woodcock, the Baltimore oriole, the black-billed cuckoo, the magnolia warbler, the ruby-throated hummingbird, and the wood thrush. And in this background sheet, we have information about the variables, the source, and something that I think could be really helpful to teachers is that we have inquiry idea starters, so we can show you how you might start thinking about the data set with students. All right, now I want to do the fun part and actually dive into the data. So in all of your Data Jam data sets, there's going to be a box on top that links you to the data. And these are all provided in Google Sheets, but you can totally easily convert them to Excel if that's something that your students want to do. And I see that it's opening up really slowly. Oh, there we go. And I want to have some time to look at these data together. So, Ashley, would you mind sharing the link to the webinar sheet of the data?
Okay, it's in the chat now.
Awesome. Okay. I'm going to have you all try to open this up And if you can't open it, that's okay. You can look on the shared screen. Okay. All right. Who do we have in the data set right now?
Cindy's in there.
Cindy's in there. I see Ashley's in there. All right, I'll just keep sharing screen for those who are not able to get into the data set yet. What I want to do is just take a look at this together and just talk about what we see. What are some observations that you notice about this data set, or maybe some questions that you have? So we'll just look at this first part. What are the variables that we have in this data set?
Shelley, could you maybe increase it a little bit?
Definitely. How's that?
That looks good, thank you.
Cool.
So we've got the year and the species and they arrive, and I'm not sure what the source means. Is that a local club? I think you had said that on the background sheet, which I didn't catch.
The source is which local club actually made that observation of the bird. And it's so cool that we have that data all the way back from the late 1800s, right? People were out observing the same birds that we're seeing now.
Why did it stop in 2008?
2008 was when the scientists published the paper about this work. And so we have a kind of old data set, but I'm sure we could revisit all of those clubs and find the data from 2009 to 2021. It'd be really interesting because we might see some changes in the trends, especially with climate change accelerating.
Right.
So if you scroll down, you'll see that we have all the other birds listed in here. And I'm just curious, for those of you who are able to get into the data set, if you scroll around a little bit, what are some things you notice or you're curious about just from looking at these numbers? Before we even begin graphing, what do you notice or what are you curious about?
So I have a quick question. The date there, that means like day one would be January 1st. Is that how that works?
Definitely. So this variable here, the first report, it's a Julian date. So what that means is we count all the days in the year. January 1st is day number 1, January 2nd is day number 2, etc. And that's the day that we saw that bird. So for example, in 1887, the American woodcock was seen on the 123rd day of the year, which would be, I don't know, probably early April. And then the next year, it was seen on the 110th day. So that was probably mid or late March.
The first one, the American woodcock, I mean, I missed my line graph to really verify this, but it looks like it's bouncing around a lot. Whereas when I scrolled down and I got to the second one, what was the Baltimore Oriole, seemed much more, I guess, predictable. Seemed much truer to the same day, around the same time, not as variable.
And that's actually really interesting that you say that, because even though the Baltimore Oriole looks pretty consistent, it generally arrived around the 120th day of the year. There's some years that were crazy, right? Like in 1965, it came on January 2nd.
Right. So that definitely leads me to believe, like, is that just an outlier? Somebody thought they saw an Oriole on January 2nd, and then so I guess like, is that observation just one bird and then maybe they didn't see another bird until the 120th day? Or does that mean the whole flock of them arrived that early? I don't know.
That's a really good question. What these data are saying is that's the first time that someone from these birding clubs saw a Baltimore Oriole, or as you mentioned, they thought they saw a Baltimore Oriole. Maybe they were wrong. Maybe it was actually a robin, and this person was like, well, I don't know. I think it's a Baltimore Oriole. But it's not about the whole flock arriving. It's the first time a single individual bird came. But I really love that you brought up that point about being skeptical about the data, because there's no way for us to go back to 1965 and talk to whoever that person was. I totally wish we could. But I think this is a good practice to have with your students, of looking at data and being skeptical about what we see.
And I noticed something too, Shelley. I noticed that there is not a Julian date for some of the entries.
Interesting. Oh yeah, like for example, in 2000, ruby-throated hummingbird doesn't have an entry.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. Maybe
In
those data were
1912.
lost. Yeah, actually, we're gonna make a graph together, and you're gonna notice, I think, a gap in the data at a particular historical point. I don't want to give it all away. So maybe we should make our graph, and then we'll look at that gap in the data. That's a really good point. Okay, good observations, good questions. I want to make a graph together quickly, and then give you some time to play around a little bit. So let's see, if I was going to make a graph, what kind would I want? I mean, I probably don't want my favorite pie chart. What kind of graph would be good for looking at these arrival dates over time?
Well, I'm going to vote for my line graph.
Okay, let's try it out. So you're welcome to play along with me if you want to, or you can just watch. But if you have the sheet open, feel free to go ahead and make a graph. Oh, Sue says line graph. All right, I'm hearing the votes for line graph. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight these Julian dates. I'm going to insert chart. Ah, interesting. That's not my line graph. So I'm going to have to change to a line. Okay. And I'm noticing, because I'm zoomed way, way in, that you can't see my whole graph. But all I've done so far is I've put on these Julian points. And I'm going to need an x-axis. So I'm going to add the year. Oops, sorry about that. I'm going to add the year as my x-axis. Okay. So let's see. Oh, interesting. Google thinks it doesn't want a line graph. Google wants to see a scatter plot. Let's take a look at this together. Oh, it didn't put the year on. I'm sorry, y'all. Let me try that one more time. No. Oh, I know why it won't. Okay. We're going to go back to scatter plot, and I'll tell you why in a sec. Okay. So this is the graph that this spreadsheet knows how to make. And the reason why is because it's set up with all of our birds in one column and all of the years in one column. So it was really confused when we tried to tell it to do a line graph. But if we tell it to do a scatter plot, then it understands that we have all these different years. Okay, but I think I can make you happy and add in your line and give you a trend line. Okay, so I'm going to head on over to series, and I'm going to add a trend line. And I don't like that the trend line is the same color as the points. So I'm going to make that orange and let it really stand out. Okay, and I'm going to put a little bit of stats on there. Okay. Oh. Okay, so now what I have is a graph of all of these bird sightings over time. And I have a trend line. I know, I'm sorry, Cindy, that it wasn't your line graph, but the way these data were set up didn't want to do that for me. And I don't know about you, but what I see is a mess. Do you all see any trends or anything really observable in this graph?
It's hard to see a slope of that. I think it's going down, but you can go back in and use equation and you can get the slope of the graph. And I don't know if that'll be statistical.
Yeah, so what I could do is add my label and add my equation.
So negative 0.17.
Yeah, so we have a slight downward trend, which means the birds were becoming slightly earlier. And it has an R squared value. The R squared value is telling us how well those data points fit the trend line. And the R squared value is 0.08. If it was 1, it would mean that our data points fit the trend line perfectly. If it's 0, it means that our data do not at all fit the trend line. So I think that we're not really being terribly successful with this trend line. The data are not described by it. And I think the reason for that is because the way our data sheet is set up is lumping all of the birds together, right? Each one of these blue dots represents maybe an American woodcock, maybe a Baltimore oriole, maybe a black-billed cuckoo. And so what we need to do is start teasing apart the different bird species and seeing if there are trends within the species. So Cindy, I know you are pretty active right now in the webinar and in Google Sheets. Ashley, I know you're active. Sue, I know you're in the chat. Would you all be up for about 5 minutes of data exploration on your own in the different, within the different bird species?
I'm in.
All right, awesome. Cindy's in, Ashley?
I'm
Quick
in.
question. The it says view only for me for the data, so I can't do anything with it. Do I request editor access? Is that, how do I?
It says that anyone with the link can edit. You know what you need to do?
Oh, I didn't come in through the link. I just came into the.
Yes. Go to
Okay.
the link that Ashley shared.
Okay, great.
You
Sorry
still
about
have
that.
that. Awesome. And then you should be able to do it. Okay, so here's what I've set up. So in this data sheet that we downloaded from the Data Jam page, all the birds are in sequence. And sadly, Google Sheets doesn't understand that they're different bird species. And what you'd have to do with your students is actually tease apart the different bird species. And so what I did is I made separate tabs for each bird species, American woodcock, Baltimore oriole, etc. So what I was thinking we could do for about 5 minutes is have each person who's graphing choose a different bird species and try to make a graph, hopefully a scatter plot, but if you want to try something different, that's okay too, that would potentially look at that bird's trend versus the overall non-trend for birds. Does that sound good?
Yeah. Do you want to assign birds, or are there certain birds you would like us to look at?
Cindy, you go first. Which one would you like to do?
I guess I'll do the Baltimore oriole.
Awesome. Kimberly, I think you're in now. Which bird would you like to do?
Oh, let me go for the warbler.
Nice. Okay. Ashley, how about you?
I'll go for the American woodcock.
Nice. All right, and I'm going to stop sharing and then we can just talk to each other. or we can just work independently for a couple minutes. Okay, cool. Why don't I share my screen and we can just talk about what we were able to produce just by looking at the individual bird species. And I did want to point out that one thing I thought was really cool about the data. If you remember, we had talked about a gap in the data. And you'll notice right here, let me zoom back out again. There were no data points collected. And if you check out the x-axis, that would be around 1917, 1918. So during World War I, for whatever reason, the Bird Club just wasn't able to collect the data, or maybe those data were lost. So we'll never know the story, but I thought that was really cool to just observe that in the data.
There was also a pandemic going on.
Yeah, they had a lot on their plates. Yeah, we can identify with that. All right, Ashley, you're up first.
All right, so this was the American woodcock, and I thought compared to the big graph with all the data in there for all the species, it was easier to see even before the trend line that looked like there was a decline in the data over time. So a decline in birds, the bird was arriving earlier and earlier each year. And then the trend line that I put in had an R-squared value of 0.44, which, you know, isn't super close to 1, but it is a stronger trend than was in the main graph with all the species together.
And I think I would say for the American woodcock, it seems like it was generally arriving early to mid-March, about a century ago. And now it seems like it's arriving, what's day 60 or so, maybe February. So maybe it's a whole month or so earlier that it's starting to arrive. And that looks pretty convincing to me. I mean, I know there's some variation year to year, and that could be for a whole bunch of different reasons, especially the fact that weather is variable from year to year, but it seems like the woodcock is arriving earlier and earlier, which might be an indicator of climate change. All right, let's check out that Baltimore Oriole.
So I did 2 graphs because the first graph had those outliers that we talked about. There's 5 data points that were like on January 2nd. And I didn't know how to, so the second graph on the right, I just removed those 5 just to see if it would make a difference. And I guess without those 5, well, first of all, the correlation is a little bit stronger. Still, the R-squared is 0.2, so I guess it's not very good, but it's better than with those outliers. And, you know, when I look at the slope of the line, it's really flat, which is kind of what I said at the beginning. It's not super variable. I mean, it's a little bit of a negative, but they don't seem to be as affected as the first ones we looked at.
And that's really interesting. You're saying that the Oriole's migration seems a little bit more stable. It's coming around the same time every year. And the woodcock seems to be coming much, much earlier. So how might that affect these 2 birds differently?
It all depends on their food supply.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if it's available.
Right. Is the food supply shifting with them or not? Maybe the same thing with nesting sites and nesting materials. All right, we had the black-billed cuckoo. I don't know if I made this one or Sue. Is Sue still with us? Okay, well, Sue and I were working around the same time. And one of us made this graph of the black-billed cuckoo, and it seems like that has a trend that's more similar to what we're seeing with the Baltimore Oriole. It arrives around the same time as the Baltimore Oriole, and it seems fairly steady, although there is some year-to-year variation, you know, even from one year to the next. Okay, Kimberly, you were studying the Magnolia Warbler, right?
Yeah, I have it. I did. It's in front of me, but I'm not sure where it is.
Maybe, can we have you share screen and tell us about your graph?
Sure.
Cool.
I think I have the Baltimore Oriole. What did I do with it? No, excuse me, the warbler. Hang on. I thought I did the warbler, but it's the same R squared as the birds overall. So did I?
Oh, interesting. I think you did all the birds. So you were in
I
that
did
first
all the
tab.
birds, I got it. Okay, so I was gonna
Yeah.
say, what the heck? The same R squared?
But I actually appreciate that. Now that we've looked at 3 different bird species individually, and we're back on the combined graph of all the birds, does this give you any new eyes on this graph of all the birds combined?
Yeah, I mean, we still have that it's a slight slope, but obviously this whole averaging of the species, it's hard to average the species, it's kind of a messy thing. They yeah, and getting rid of the outliers is certainly a helpful thing. Definitely a thing to do.
Yeah. So what are some takeaways from looking at these bird data that Cindy and Kimberly would bring back to your students as you approach a data set like this with students?
I think one of the first things is talking about outliers, just because students are always so ready to throw out any sort of outlier whenever, their labs don't go right. And there's a time to do that and there's a time not to do that, So, I mean, outliers are always just a really rich, they're real. Like, there's any number of reasons for them. And some of them are very interesting and legitimate and some of them are errors. But we don't know in this case. And also, like, when I think of, birds that sort of sneak and try to overwinter, when robins first started doing that, it's kind of like, it's like this risky little gambit they're taking. And, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. but, could that be, birds taking a chance in, coming back really early or never leaving, there's different story possibilities.
I love that. Thank you. Cindy, what would you take back to your students if you're going to look at this data set with them?
It made me ask more questions, to be honest. Like we were saying, well, I wonder why, one of them was more stable, and I would actually look up the food supply, and I also want to look at the average temperature for that year. And I would love to see an overlay of like the temperature and when there were these huge dips or outliers or whatever. So I guess that's not looking at it with a closed focus, but in some sort of perspective. Yeah.
And I love that you brought up temperature because that's a whole nother can of worms, right? Like, do we look at the average temperature by week or by month, or do we need to plot average temperature of each day? And what really matters, is it the high, the low, or the average? So there's all these different ways that you can branch out with these data. And
it might be different for different birds because of their food supply. And so if it's some grasses that have some sort of tolerable, temperature and precipitation range or whatever, so it might even be different for different birds.
And also it might be even more dependent on the temperature where they're overwintering than here.
Oh.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't even think about that.
And that's kind of interesting because we can look at that now with modern data, but we might not be able to look at that from these data from 1885. And people who were studying the birds and collecting these data back then might not have even known what was going on in the Caribbean or wherever these birds were coming from because they were just so cut off from communication. So if we think this is mysterious now, just imagine how mysterious it was for them back in the 1800s. Ashley, I want to give you a chance. Was there anything that you would take away from this and think about with students as you were looking at this data set?
Yeah, so I'll say that I'm very partial to birds and I love birds. But aside from that, I think that this data set is extra fun because like you're saying, you can look at things like food supply, but also like habitat, air temperature, when we're water sources melting or not, or when we're different trees blooming, or like you're talking about grasses and seeds. And yeah, I just think it's so rich because you're not only talking about migration patterns, you're looking at animal behavior and habitat needs. And it's a really holistic way of telling the story of the data that I think you can also do with any of the other data sets as well. So I think that's something to keep in mind, is like, how can you tie in all these other different aspects of the ecosystem in telling the story?
Yeah, I agree. And also, how can you help students dig into the discomfort of not knowing everything when they're looking at a data set and help expand that curiosity? Well, I want to say thank you for looking at this data set with me. Every time I look at this, I see something new. So I really appreciate that you all dove into that with me and gave me fresh eyes. I know we're close to the end, but I just want to take a couple minutes and really briefly show you the TUVA software, and then you can explore that on your own or ask follow-up questions. And Ashley's sharing the link, but I'm also going to happily screen share so you can see the data portal. So a lot of people use Google Sheets with their class or Excel. And that works great for some students, but others need something that's a little bit easier. And we have this Tuba portal that we made a couple years ago that is all drag and drop graphing. So you go into this Hudson Valley ecosystem page and navigate to the data sets. And then once you're in there, most of our Hudson Data Jam data sets are in this page. And I know that the bird data set is a level 1. So I'm just going to directly navigate to that. Okay, spring bird migration dates. Okay. And when I get to this, it gives me a little bit of info about the data set. I know there's more on the Data Jam page. But the really cool thing is we have this beautiful software that just plops down all the points. We get mixed up cases. So all those bird observations are just a dot on here. I want to recreate one of our graphs that we just made. So what am I going to put on the x-axis?
The
year.
Julian calendar. The year.
Oh, we have disagreement.
Eh.
What am I going to put on the x-axis? All right, I'm going to go with year. So it's super easy. All you do is you grab it and you drag it onto this right here. And now what it's doing is it's taking all those data points and it's just kind of like stacking them up on the year. And again, you can see during World War I and that pandemic, people just did not give a hoot about birds for whatever reason. They had a lot going on. And then I'm going to recreate
right there.
Yeah. And you see there's more consistent data as we get into modern years, right? The data was pretty sparse back in the late 1800s. So even that's a cool conversation you could have with students, step by step. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take our first report by the Julian date, and I'm just going to drag it onto the y-axis. And it takes a little while to think, and it's making us a beautiful scatter plot. And I see once again, all of our data are mixed up, but I want to look at the individual bird species. So I'm going to click on that. And now we finally have that graph where we can see all the bird species together, which is really, really cool. The one thing I want to do just to make your life a little bit easier is change the color for the American woodcock.
Wait, I missed how you got the separate bird species.
Tuba, oh, hang on a second. Let me just change this color and then I'll go back and show you.
Sorry,
Yeah.
I was looking online and I.
Yeah, I'm happy to show that. Hang on, let me just move the Zoom thing. Okay, so all I did was I clicked on bird species and then it just popped up on the right and labeled all the bird species for me.
Okay, so you don't have to drag it anywhere. You just click on it.
You just click on it and then it should pop up. So now I have all my birds together, which is what I wanted in that Google Sheet, but we couldn't get it with the way it was set up. And then I know Cindy's going to want a trend line. So what I can do in TUVA is I can go to, where is it? This line looking thing up here. and I'm gonna add a least squares line. For whatever reason, that's what they call their trend line. And you tell me, is this the line that we want?
It certainly is the line that looked like that first trend line that you did with the R squared of 0.08.
Yeah, and
So
it
it's-
really wasn't helpful. It just showed us the average of the birds. So what
It
I
would be
actually want to do is go back in and do a line by category.
category. Oh my gosh.
And now I get a trend line for every single bird species from this data set.
Wow.
And I
Is
can add
TUVA
labels.
something that you worked on just?
Say that again.
Sorry. This is fantastic.
Isn't
Oh,
it great?
look at that Oriole. Like that really, that's beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah, and you can see the oriole and the black-billed cuckoo, the magnolia warbird, they're all kind of similar. And then this orange one here was one that Ashley graphed, the American woodcock. And that's the one that we can see is really dropping in slope and coming earlier and earlier and earlier. And if you want to, you can either hover over them and you can see the stats. It's got the equation and not the R squared, but it gives you R value. So you have to do a little bit of math and actually square it. But you can also add your labels if you want to put them on, and then they all just kind of show up in a mess and you can drag them around. So I can see exploring Google Sheets is a really good thing to do with students because they get to see the numbers and they get to actually manipulate data in a way that's pretty advanced and high skill. But if you want your students to be able to just really quickly look at data and move it around and ask a lot of questions, this is a really, really nice software for doing that. Do you all have any questions about TUVA?
Is it just for your data sets or can you import your own data?
Yeah, you can import your own data. You can set up an account and add, I think, 5 data sets for free. And once you hit that 5, you can always delete one of your data sets and add in a new one. Or you can get a paid account, and then I think you can add unlimited. And TUVA also has a huge library of data sets about everything. I know they have one about NASCAR. I think they have a bunch about cookies. They have some about the ocean. And a lot of them are sourced by teachers, and they have resources and curriculum to go with them. So it's a really awesome resource.
It's great.
Yeah, it's awesome.
Can I add something, Shelley, real quick?
Definitely.
So I was just gonna say, like on that graph with everything in there, you can easily like go into the variables and just select individual bird species as well. So if your students wanted to create an individual graph for each one, they could still do that easily in TUVA. And then with TUVA, I recommend, I know we all get a million emails all the time, but TUVA sends a really nice, like maybe one email a week that kind of summarizes and points you to these new cool data sets or tutorials. And I found it really helpful, especially during data jam season, because you can work your way through tutorials to do a line graph or to do other kinds of graphs and stuff. So I would encourage you to check that out.
Yeah, thanks. I know we are at time, so I want to respect everyone's time, but also if you have any last questions or comments, feel free, go ahead.
No, just want to say thank you.
Great.
Yes, I second that. Thank you.
Thank
Yeah,
you for
and
joining
so
today.
There are more of these about the creative side or other aspects of Data Jam, is that right? Okay.
Yeah, so the one on Tuesday is going to be about using all different kinds of art mediums. And then the one on Thursday will be specifically about infographics. And then the final webinar will be the following Tuesday, and that will be an advanced data, like graphing and data analysis workshop. And for that, there's actually there's a Google form link that was included on the registration page for this webinar, and I can follow up and email it to you all. But if you're interested in diving even deeper into data, we will be leading a workshop kind of looking at some different funky things that you can do to manipulate data in different ways.
Yeah, I would appreciate that link. I don't know if I have that. If you could email that out, that would be great.
Yeah, I would be happy to. And yeah, I think that's all I have, Shelley. I wanted to thank you both too, Cindy and Kimberly, for joining, and we would love to see you again in the future. And Shelley, thank you so much for being a guest in this webinar series and doing a stellar job of guiding through the whole process. Shelley, do you have anything else to share before we close out?
No, I just want to say thanks to both of you for playing along and taking some risks and trying out the data and asking amazing questions. I'm sure you both do the same thing with your students every day, and I'm sure that they love being in your class and learning from and with you.
Thank you.
Great, thanks.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Yeah,
Good night.
have a good night. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.